China is a nation with a long history. It stands out over its less powerful neighbors for most of the time. The late Qing dynasty was no exception. This superior feeling of China gradually turned into arrogance. It viewed all other nations as inferiors. While the West had finished the Industrial Revolution, China thought it had nothing to learn from outside, even with its backward agricultural economy. Then came the First Opium War around 1840, and China lost to the Britons. The war woke China up to find it was falling behind. The West had harnessed advanced military capability that China was no match to. The Qing government began to send officers and students to learn abroad, hoping they could bring back Western technology and empower China. It also started to set up factories to produce modern machines and military equipment. This so-called self-strength movement was mainly supervised by Li Hongzhang, a senior officer in the government. One of the many companies Li set up was China Merchant Steam Navigation Company, which developed into China Merchants Group, one of the biggest state-owned conglomerates in today's China. My bank account was opened at its subsidiary, China Merchants Bank. Although the Westerners knew Qing was backward in technology, they still feared it because before the Opium War because of its sheer size and large population. But after the war, they found the giant was so weak that they all began to take advantage of it through force. Karl Marx said that production relations must fit the material productive forces. The new productive forces of the West were born from its capitalist economy. The Qing government was a monarchy and had no way to harness these new forces through its old organization structure. Japan was late in the game of taking a slice of China, but became the most aggressive. It fought the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and won it decisively. The military failure marked the end of the self-strength movement in China. It taught a lesson that monarchy with Western tech could not save China. More fundamental societal changes were needed. Although China had sent some people to the West after the Opium War, there were not that many. The Qing government had been very conservative in connecting with the outside. After the First War with Japan, the Qing government was required to send students to Japan as Japan wanted to cultivate pro-Japan officers and expand their influence in China in the future. At the time, the Qing government had changed its mind and welcomed this request as they attributed their failure for not being able to learn enough from the West. They wanted to do some more fundamental reforms. They would like to learn not only the technology, but the organizational models from the West. So China opened its gate. Many government-sponsored or self-funded students began to travel abroad. Japan was the top destination. Among those going to Japan, there were later famous people in China, including Lu Xun and Jiang Jieshi. While the military forces built during the self-strength movement were equipped with modernized weapons, they were trained and organized in the old way. After the 1894 war, the Qing government began building new armies. These armies were trained and organized fully in the Western style, with some of their instructors being foreigners. Both the central and local governments trained the new armies, with the central one being the best funded. Yuan Shikai was chosen to lead the new army of the central government. This appointment was a recognition for his achievement in Korea. Korea was historically a client state of China and an early invasion target of Japan. Japanese had been plotting a coup in Korea for several years before their war with China. Yuan was then the commander of the Chinese force in Korea and helped the pro-China rulers navigate the military and political quandaries successfully. His maneuvers helped the Qing government to maintain its influence on Korea. Yuan trained the new army in Tianjin using the Qing's resources, but gradually turned it into his personal asset and made it only loyal to him. The army, nevertheless, grew to be the most powerful military group in China, known as the Bayan clique. Many of the later warlords came from it. There were also powerful warlords that came from the local new armies. For example, Yan Xishan started his career in the Shanxi New Army after his graduation from a military academy in Japan. Since the First Opium War, the Qing government had paid tens of millions of taels of silver to the Western powers and signed many unequal treaties that gave foreigners much privilege. For example, the customs duties were collected by foreigners, and the government could only take a small share of it. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan asked 200 million taels of silver from the Qing government. All this money must come somewhere. The only place the government could collect this much money was from the average Chinese people. The conflicts between the people and the monarchy intensified. Recognizing the powers of the Western countries, the Qing government became more and more servile to their requests. This also made the people angry with its rule. Seeing this crisis, some young officers proposed reforms that would model Qing government along the Japanese constitutional monarchy. But the ruling class turned it down as there were so many vested interests against the reforms. The foreign powers also wanted to keep the Qing government as it was, as they found it was a very good servant and did not want China to become powerful. The Qing government sponsored overseas students with the aim that they would come back and help strengthen the country and its ruling. Ironically, after opening their eyes and mind in the foreign countries, many of them began to realize how corrupt and hopeless the Qing government was. A lot of them became agitated and believed that reforms would not save China. They wanted a revolution to topple down the monarchy. Xin Zhongshan was one of them. He was born in a poor family in Guangdong with his big brother recruited to work in US when he was young. The big brother managed to become rich in Hawaii and sponsored Sun to study there to become a doctor. He abandoned his medical study after coming back to China as he saw it was not a way to save the country. He then became one of the first people who put revolution into practice in China, but his first revolution failed. The society had not been ready for revolution. Although the conflict between the people and the monarchy had intensified, the idea of a capitalist revolution had not been widely known among the people. The Qing dynasty had ruled China for hundreds of years and had recently quelled the Taiping Rebellion. People did not see why another uprising would succeed. On the other hand, while the monarchy was weak compared to the Western powers, it was still the dominant force within China. There was no other military power that was able to challenge its supremacy. Sun, with hundreds of his companions, looked tiny in the face of the Qing army. Most people did not understand him and his idea. Many of the monarchy supporters even condemned him and his revolution. He left China after the failure. Revolution, in essence, is a movement that changes people's mind rather than the government. Imagine if all people except the ruling class in a country accepted the revolution idea overnight and put it into practice. The country will be revolutionized overnight without much struggle. The ruling class is always a minority. They rely on the ruled to maintain their ruling. If all those ruled became united and rebelled, the ruling class would be very weak and easily toppled. This is for sure an ideal scenario, but it highlights the importance of spreading the revolution idea among the people. Booklet and a newspaper is one way to propagandize revolution. Military struggle is another. In a sense, war is not an end to itself, but a propaganda machine for the cause. Mao Zedong had recognized this point early in his life. He had stipulated that the Red Army is a military group to execute the political cause, and asked the Red Army to advertise communism and educate the people wherever and whenever they could. So although Sun's first revolution failed, it helped a lot to spread the idea and lay the foundation for future revolutions. With the revolution idea becoming more and more popular, many revolution groups were founded both within China and abroad. Their specific goals were not aligned, but all shared the aim to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Xin Zhongshan was then in Japan. He combined several of such groups and formed the Tongmenghui, the biggest and most influential revolution society at that time. Under the command of Tongmenghui, several revolutions were initiated in southern China, but all failed. Again, despite their failure, these movements helped promote the revolution idea, and people became more familiar and welcoming to it. Their attitudes towards these revolutions were quite different from the first revolution, and they began to sympathize the revolutionaries. The ideological foundation for a successful revolution became increasingly solid. More and more people began to recognize that to save China, the Qing dynasty must be overthrown. Propaganda was important, but a revolution still needs arms and army. Where should these come from? The Qing government still commands most of the military resource in China, while the revolutionaries had almost nothing. It turned out that the way was to defeat it from the inside. As I have mentioned, the Qing government trained the new armies to strengthen itself. As the new army was fully westernized, many of its leaders and trainers were students who had studied abroad and had close connections with other overseas students. They were more likely to have revolutionary friends and more accepting to the revolution idea. Some were actually revolutionaries by themselves. Besides, as the new armies had a difficult curriculum, most of its soldiers were literate and knowledgeable. They were more easily influenced by the revolution idea than the average soldier. As a result, some of the officers and soldiers began to form secret groups within the army to promote revolution. When the conditions permitted, they would turn their guns to the Qing government, who provided their salaries. The several failed revolutions led by Tongmenghui actually had some new army divisions as their force. Here again, ironically, the Qing government spent money to overthrow itself. With the further spreading of the revolution idea and the intensifying conflicts between the Qing government and the people, the condition for a revolution's success became more and more mature. There is a phrase in Chinese called "no zuo no die," which means that if you do not do something foolish, you won't get hurt. But the Qing government did do something foolish. While it was under pressure to pay for loss of wars, it saw it a good opportunity to generate revenue to nationalize the Citron Railway, a railway that was built by the private money. This caused rage across the nation. Under this anti-Qing government atmosphere, the revolutionaries in the Hubei New Army, a local new army in Hubei province, started the first military operation and successfully took over Wuchang, the then capital of the Hubei province. Then in the next few months, most of the southern provinces were in the hands of revolutionaries. This series of successful uprisings were famously called the Xinhai Revolution, as this year was the Xinhai year in the lunar calendar. Although the revolutionaries agreed upon overthrowing the Qing government, they did not have a well-considered plan for what to do afterwards. The leaders in the Hubei uprising were all junior officers. They did not feel they were qualified to lead the new government. They wanted to have a senior officer to be the head. So they chose Li Yuanhong, who was then the highest ranked military officer in Wuchang. But Li was not a revolutionary. He was hiding in his friend's home when the uprising happened. He was kind of forced to be the head of the new government against his will. Soon after the Xinhai Revolution, the representatives from the southern provinces agreed to form the Republic of China. Xin Zhongshan, who had come back after the revolution, was elected the president. Li was elected to be the vice president. ROC, the Republic of China, is now the government in Taiwan. The Qing government was shocked by the news in Hubei. They immediately ordered the Bayan army to quell the uprising in the south. At the time, the previous head of the army, Yuan Shikai, was killing his time in his hometown as he was fired by the Qing government. The reason was that a political struggle happened after the death of the old ruler who supported Yuan, and the new ruling clique distrusted him and wanted to take back the military control. However, they found the Bayan army, which was trained by Yuan from the start, did not follow their orders. They only followed Yuan. Facing the immediate crisis in the south, the Qing government had to call Yuan back and put him in a position more powerful than before. As I have said, the Bayan army was the central new army with the best resources. The local new armies grasped by the ROC were no match. When Yuan Shikai began to send his troops to the battlefield, the ROC began to lose. But Yuan was politically sensitive, and he knew that revolution was an inevitable trend, so he negotiated with the ROC in secret for peace. Sun Zhongshan knew his troops were no match to Yuan's, and did not want more people to lose their lives in the war, so he supported the negotiation. Because of his military power, Yuan prevailed. Sun agreed to let Yuan to be the president under two conditions. First, he had to ask the monarch to end his ruling. Second, he had to move to Nanjing, the capital of ROC, to be the president. Yuan indeed forced the last emperor to give up his ruling and ended the monarchy that had dominated China for more than 1,000 years. However, after swearing into the ROC president, Yuan came up with all sorts of excuses not to come to Nanjing, as Beijing was where all his connections and power reside. Instead, he managed to move the central government to Beijing and set up the rule of China from there. This ROC government, controlled by the Bayan clique, was also called the Bayan Government.